Have you ever wondered how a nation so vast, so feared, and so tightly controlled could disappear without a single gunshot? How the Soviet Union, with its tanks, missiles, and flags on the moon, could simply stop existing? Hello, world history lovers. Tonight we descend into a story that doesn't begin with war, but with silence. A quiet, eerie unraveling of one of the most powerful empires in human history. Welcome to this slow, immersive journey into the question, how did the Soviet Union vanish in a single night? Before we dive deeper, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. It's always amazing to see this strange, quiet history reach across time zones. And if you love drifting through forgotten moments like this, don't forget to gently tap subscribe. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Because this isn't just a political story, it's a slow-motion collapse. And the first thing to fall was the silence. It began with a holiday, a quiet one. December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day in the West, but just another cold Wednesday in Moscow. The Soviet Union didn't celebrate Christmas. It hadn't in decades. The trees in Red Square stood bare. The streets were quiet. Factories still rumbled, soldiers still guarded their posts. And somewhere in the heart of the Kremlin, a man prepared to end an empire. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary, President, reformist, final ruler of a state that no longer ruled itself. But the people outside his walls didn't know yet. They were still living as Soviets, carrying ration cards, queuing for bread, watching TV with static-filled pride. And they were used to silence. They didn't know the system was already dead. For months, the machinery of the Soviet state had been breaking down, not with violence, but with paperwork. Borders were dissolving on maps, but no one updated the signs. Republics had declared independence, but no one left their posts. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion, from the inside. The Baltic states had peeled away first, then Ukraine, then Kazakhstan. Each time the Union got smaller. Each time it pretended nothing had happened. And the people? They waited, not in protest, not in celebration, but in confusion, because no one told them what came next. The Soviet Union had never taught its people how to imagine a future without it. And so, on that cold December day, Mikhail Gorbachev walked alone into his office with one final order, a televised resignation, just 10 minutes long, no speeches to the people, no calls to the army, no ceremony, just a single message, broadcast once, then never again. At 7 p.m. Moscow time, he appeared on screen, pale, calm, the flag of the USSR behind him. And with the quiet tone of a school teacher stepping down, he announced that he was no longer president because the country he presided over no longer existed. Then he folded the papers, took a breath, and walked out. At 7:32 p.m., the red Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle that had flown over the Kremlin for 70 years, was lowered. In its place, the white, blue-red tricolor of the Russian Federation rose silently. No crowd, no applause, no gunfire, just two guards pulling a rope in the wind. It was over, but no one said it out loud. And across 11 time zones, from frozen military bases in Siberia to the quiet alleys of Leningrad, people looked out their windows and wondered, was that it? Because the strange thing is, the end didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. There were no explosions, no tanks, no press conference, just a televised message. And then normal programming resumed. Western news called it historic. But inside the USSR, people turned off the TV and made tea. They went to sleep still clutching Soviet passports, still using Soviet money, still humming Soviet songs. No one told them what to do next. So they did what they'd always done. They waited. And this is where the story becomes less about governments and more about people. Ordinary people, scattered across a crumbling map, trying to make sense of a world that no longer had borders. Soldiers who didn't know who they served anymore. Teachers who didn't know which history to teach. Families who didn't know which country they woke up in. The empire was gone, but the infrastructure remained. The pipes still ran, the power grid still buzzed, the anthem still echoed in memory. The USSR had disappeared legally, but emotionally it lingered like smoke after a fire. And that's where we begin. The strange part about collapse is that it rarely feels like a collapse. When we picture the fall of an empire, we imagine fire, revolutions, bombs, chaos. But the death of the Soviet Union didn't come with a bang. It came with flickering fluorescent lights in government buildings, with unpaid workers sweeping floors no one walked on, with flags still fluttering even after the country they represented no longer legally existed. Across the former republics, Armenia, Tajikistan, Belarus, Ukraine, Latvia, there were no instructions, no roadmap. One day, you were Soviet. The next day, you weren't. But your documents didn't change. Your street signs didn't change. Your neighbors didn't change. Only the silence changed. People woke up the day after the USSR died and still went to work, still stood in line for butter, still sat in classrooms decorated with Lenin posters. The hammer and sickle was gone from the Kremlin, but it lived in people's eyes, their habits, their assumptions. Because when you've spent your whole life under one system, even if it vanishes overnight, your mind still walks its corridors. It's not easy to erase a world, especially when it raised you. In rural towns, the disappearance of the USSR wasn't an event, it was a rumor. No one came to announce it. There were no loudspeakers, no headlines that said, "It's over." The few newspapers that printed the resignation ran it small. On state-controlled television, some anchors spoke about a transition. Others just carried on, reading news about harvest quotas and sports updates. In places like Yakutsk, Omsk, and Murmansk, where the winters could eat you alive, survival was more urgent than politics. People were too busy patching boots and foraging potatoes to debate geopolitics. For them, the empire hadn't fallen. The snow still fell. The pipes still groaned. And the silence. That was normal. They'd grown up with silence. It was safer than asking too many questions. But in the capitals, in Moscow, in Kyiv, in Tbilisi, the silence felt heavier. There, you could feel the absence. Because cities remember structure, bureaucrats came to work the next day and found their departments renamed. Soldiers stood at checkpoints but weren't sure who had issued the orders. Some officers took off their uniforms that day and never put them back on. Others kept them on out of habit, unsure if they were protecting a country that no longer existed. The KGB, once the terrifying eyes and ears of the state, became confused. Some agents went home, others shredded documents, others simply stayed at their desks and waited. No one told them to stop, but no one told them to continue either. And in systems built on command, silence is more frightening than orders. Currency became a riddle. The Soviet ruble was technically obsolete, but it remained in circulation. People still got paid in it. Stores still accepted it. But inflation was eating it alive. Prices tripled. Shelves emptied. And those who had saved their entire lives in Soviet rubles suddenly realized that loyalty to a dead empire wasn't currency. It was debt. Pensioners watched their savings evaporate. Families bartered for flour and cooking oil. Black markets bloomed like weeds in abandoned lots. And all of it happened in a vacuum where no one was sure who was in charge. Because that's the thing about collapse. It doesn't just kill governments, it kills instructions. And in the absence of instruction, people began to improvise. Former Soviet republics scrambled to print their own currencies, issue new passports, form provisional governments. Flags changed, anthems changed, school books were rewritten by candlelight, but it wasn't coordinated, it wasn't synchronized. It was messy, erratic, and deeply human. In Georgia, a war broke out. In Moldova, tensions exploded. In Azerbaijan, old wounds reopened. National identities that had been frozen for decades under Soviet rule now burst forward, proud, confused, and angry. Ethnic conflicts re-erupted. Lines were redrawn, not on paper, but in blood. And yet, even as these fires spread, most people remained numb. Because after a lifetime of fear, your first instinct isn't to shout, it's to wait. Meanwhile, in the West, politicians toasted. News anchors spoke of victory. The Cold War was over, they said. Freedom had won. But freedom, to the people living in crumbling apartment blocks with no heat, meant uncertainty. Freedom meant joblessness. Freedom meant waking up in a country with a new name and no roadmap. Entire industries vanished overnight. Military factories that once built tanks for a global empire now stood abandoned. Scientists who once designed satellites now sold cigarettes on street corners. Teachers who had taught Marx for 20 years now had to explain capitalism without textbooks. And worst of all, there were no answers, only questions. And no one in power dared to answer them. In Russia, a new flag waved. A new president stepped in. Boris Yeltsin, the man who had once stood on a tank to defend democracy, now stood behind podiums filled with nervous promises. He told people to be patient, that change would come, that markets would open, that prosperity would return. But words didn't buy bread, and the winter of 1992 was long, very long. In many places, it felt like the temperature dropped the moment the Soviet flag came down. Not just the physical cold, but the emotional freeze that follows collapse. Because when a system ends, it doesn't matter whether it was good or bad. What matters is that it was all you knew. And now, there's nothing in its place. That was the atmosphere, quiet, suspended, like a stage where the actors had left, but the lights were still on, and the audience was waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. When the empire fell, no one told the prisoners. Not the literal ones behind bars, though many of them did remain forgotten, but the ordinary citizens who had been raised behind an invisible wall their entire lives. They had been taught to march in straight lines, to salute portraits, to fear silence more than chaos. They were not trained for improvisation. So when the foundation disappeared, it didn't collapse dramatically. It disintegrated under their feet while they stood frozen, unsure whether to sit, run, or salute. And in that stillness across the former republics of the Soviet Union, life split into two versions. One version was visible. Cities trying to rename themselves, governments trying to sound confident, television anchors switching to new scripts. The other version was invisible, carried in the backs of minds and the muscle memory of people who still lined up politely, still whispered, still looked over their shoulder before speaking. Because even if the USSR was dead, the habits it bred were still very much alive. Children born in the last years of the USSR didn't fully understand what had changed, only that their parents looked more tired. Teachers skipped lessons. Stores seemed emptier. Grandparents grew quieter. Some of them cried while watching old Soviet movies, not because they missed the politics, but because those films reminded them of when life made sense. In many homes, family portraits hung alongside old medals, relics of fathers who fought at Stalingrad, mothers who built steel during the 5-year plans. To throw away those memories felt like betrayal. but to hold on to them too tightly felt like denial. So most people didn't say much. They just carried it all. The pride, the confusion, the shame, like an invisible suitcase with no handles. Newspapers kept printing, but no one trusted them. Too many lies had passed through their pages. Now that the old state was gone, every headline felt like either a joke or a trap. The stories promised reform, but people remembered promises before. They'd heard slogans about bright futures. They'd seen photos of parades with smiling children and tanks dressed in flowers. But now, the only parade was the slow march of inflation. The only flowers were wilted in shop windows. Many began to hoard sugar, flour, batteries, not because they were told to, but because the collapse taught them something primal. Security is fiction, and fiction doesn't feed your kids. The radios were still on, the songs still played, but they sounded different, less triumphant, more like echoes from another planet. Some stations switched to Western pop and it sounded alien, too fast, too optimistic. Other channels played nothing but old Soviet classics, brass-heavy marches, melancholic ballads, and that sounded ghostly too. Like the air itself hadn't figured out which country it belonged to anymore. And somewhere in the background of every song was that creeping, impossible question. If this isn't the USSR anymore, then what are we? Some people answered with nationalism. Across the former republics, ethnic identity roared back like a sleeping giant. Old languages were revived, statues were toppled, place names were restored to their pre-Soviet roots. In some places, it was peaceful. In others, it turned violent. Wars broke out not because people wanted blood, but because lines drawn decades ago by Stalin suddenly mattered again. In places like Chechnya, the question wasn't just independence. It was survival. In the Baltics, people looked west. In Belarus, they looked cautiously in both directions. In Ukraine, the soul of a nation stood at a crossroads, pulled between memory and possibility. The USSR may have died, but it left behind children who each told a different version of the story. And those stories would shape the 21st century. But not everyone was busy with politics. Most people were busy surviving. The old guarantees, free housing, free health care, guaranteed jobs, disappeared. What replaced them was a market economy in name only. Prices soared, wages didn't. Doctors became taxi drivers. Engineers became smugglers. University professors sold cigarettes on sidewalks. Not because they lost faith in knowledge, but because knowledge didn't pay rent anymore. Across Russia and the other former Soviet republics, a new class emerged. Not entrepreneurs in the Western sense, but survivors of the vacuum. The black market became the real market. Corruption became currency. And the state that once controlled every breath now didn't even deliver clean water. At the same time, nostalgia began to bloom, quietly. At first, it was just in memories. Remember when buses were free. Remember when we had jobs. Remember when we were a superpower. But over time, nostalgia became a comfort drug. Not because the USSR had been paradise. Everyone remembered the lines, the shortages, the censorship. But back then, people had known who they were, what rules they lived under, what future they were told to expect. Now, the rules kept changing. The goalposts kept moving. And for many, freedom felt less like a sunrise and more like a fog. For the generation that had grown up under the red banner, watching it fall wasn't just symbolic. It was personal. That flag had been on their birth certificates, their diplomas, their military IDs. It had draped the coffins of their fathers. It had flown on the moon. And now it was gone, not torn down by war, not defeated in battle, but quietly folded and placed in a box. as if 70 years of history could be filed away like expired paperwork. The sadness wasn't for the state. It was for the identity that had been erased without ceremony. And so people did what humans always do when the world no longer makes sense. They found rituals, some clung to religion. Churches reopened, candles were lit, baptisms resumed. Others turned inward, into poetry, into vodka, into stories of what once was. And some tried to build something new, a new business, a new flag, a new constitution, but deep down, most were still waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. Because that's what no one ever tells you about the fall of an empire. The hardest part isn't losing the power, it's losing the explanation. The strangest thing about the disappearance of the Soviet Union wasn't the politics. It was the silence. Not just the silence in the Kremlin hallways or in the palaces of former party officials. No, it was the silence in people's kitchens, in the basements of apartment blocks, in the frozen corners of schoolyards where children whispered without knowing why. Silence was the language of transition, and across 11 time zones it blanketed the former USSR like ash. No one knew what to say, not even the winners, because no one had rehearsed the script for this kind of ending. Empires were supposed to fall with war, with blood, with dramatic final speeches. This one didn't. It dissolved like breath on a mirror, visible for a second, then gone. And yet, life didn't stop. That's the cruel magic of collapse. The trains still ran, mostly. The power still flickered on, sometimes. Teachers still came to class, even if the curriculum was falling apart faster than the chalkboard. It was like watching an orchestra continue playing after the conductor has vanished. There was momentum, sure, but direction, gone. Ministries still sent memos. Offices still stamped papers. But no one really knew who they were reporting to anymore. The party was gone. The ideology had been buried in December 1991 with one televised signature. But bureaucracy is a strange creature. It outlives ideology. So clerks filed forms, policemen patrolled intersections, generals gave orders, all without truly understanding which flag was now hanging above their heads. This created a kind of psychological dislocation that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through the death of a nation. One moment, your life is mapped out. Childhood, university, party membership, a state job, a modest apartment, retirement. The next moment, that entire road has been bulldozed and no one has laid a new one. So you keep walking forward, pretending the pavement is still there. People kept showing up to their state jobs even when the state had stopped paying them. Scientists came to shuttered laboratories. Factory workers arrived at gates chained shut. Why? Because the alternative, admitting that the world you were trained to serve had ceased to exist, was too enormous to grasp all at once. It was easier to pretend, at least for a while. And it wasn't just individuals who were lost, whole cities were stranded. Consider the secret cities, the ones that didn't appear on maps. In the Soviet era, these were the industrial and scientific hubs of the Cold War. Places like Chelyabinsk 40 or Tomsk 7, nuclear towns, research towns, populated entirely by workers who had signed up to live outside the visible world. They were guarded, controlled, and loyal. But when the Union fell, many of these cities didn't receive new orders. Their budgets vanished, their supply chains collapsed, and the secrecy that once protected them became a curse. Some were simply abandoned, others limped on, forgotten by both the past and the future. Imagine living in a city that technically didn't exist anymore. That was the reality for thousands. Worse still were the military installations. The USSR was a state built for war, even in peacetime. Missile silos, air bases, submarine pens carved into Arctic rock. When the collapse came, many of these installations were simply left as they were. Armed, fueled, guarded by men who no longer received wages. It sounds like the opening scene of a thriller, but it was daily life in the early 1990s. There were Soviet soldiers in East Germany who didn't have the money to return home. Soviet sailors in the Pacific with no orders, no food, no flag. Some units sold fuel to local gangs. Others turned to banditry, and no one in Moscow had the resources to regain control. The empire had collapsed, but the weapons hadn't vanished with it. At the same time, the mafia stepped forward to fill the vacuum. In the Soviet years, organized crime had existed in the shadows, tolerated in some regions, crushed in others, but in the absence of state control, it emerged like mold through the cracks of every institution. Criminals took over factories, ports, banks. They weren't just street thugs, they were men in suits with deep connections to former KGB operatives and ex-party elites. The 1990s in Russia and across much of the post-Soviet space became known as the Wild East. Carjackings, assassinations, extortion. It was chaos wrapped in pinstripe suits. And the average citizen, already exhausted from economic collapse, learned a new rule of survival. Don't ask who owns the building now. Just pay your rent and keep your head down. But what may have been most devastating and least visible was the emotional erosion. Hope is a fragile thing. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't just destroy a government, it robbed millions of their sense of direction. For decades, people had been told they were part of something vast, something historical, something permanent. The USSR had trained its citizens to see themselves as gears in a mighty machine. Then one day the machine was gone, and the gears were just metal scattered on the floor. What do you do when the system that gave your life meaning disappears? For some, the answer was alcoholism. For others, religious revival. For many, it was quiet despair. Suicide rates skyrocketed. Life expectancy plummeted, and in the cities you could feel the weight of a dream that had curdled. Yet within the wreckage, something remarkable also stirred. A generation was coming of age, not shaped by ideology, but by chaos. They didn't memorize Marx in school. They memorized prices. They didn't sing party songs. They listened to bootleg Nirvana and Metallica on cassette tapes. They wore fake Adidas. They learned to hustle, to improvise, to adapt. These were the children of the collapse, born in the shadow of a dead giant. And though many of them would carry scars, they would also carry something else, a resilience that only comes from having nothing handed to you. They didn't trust the state, but they believed in survival. And sometimes, that's enough to start rebuilding. Because in the end, the story of the Soviet collapse isn't just about loss. It's about the long, painful process of becoming something new, not because you want to, but because you have no choice. When the old world dies, and no one announces it, you have to become your own messenger, your own builder, your own cartographer of a land no one has mapped yet. The USSR vanished in a single night, but its echoes, its ruins, its ghosts, its unspoken lessons are still walking among us, and perhaps they always will. You would think that when a country dies, the world would hear a sound, an explosion, a scream, at least a headline big enough to shake the sky. But the truth is, when the Soviet Union disappeared, it made almost no noise, no flags burning, no marching boots, no final anthem, just silence. It was December 1991, and the world's largest country, a nuclear superpower, a space pioneer, a dictatorship forged in revolution. Mein simply stoppert. Mein Scheiter Wurmanistischer Stabrinsing. One by one, the republics peeled off. Latvia, Georgia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan. The map started bleeding at the edges until there was nothing left but a shell called Russia and a red flag still fluttering in the cold wind of Moscow. But here's the strangest part. Even after the USSR officially ceased to exist, even after Gorbachev had resigned and the Soviet flag had been lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, the people, the actual humans who lived in its shadow, kept waking up, going to work, queuing for bread, and pretending nothing had changed. Because what else were they supposed to do? For many, the paperwork was still the same. Soviet passports were still in people's pockets. Signs still said CCCP. Teachers still called it the Union. And factories, they still ran on systems designed in the 1950s. It was like trying to reboot your life while the operating system hadn't caught up yet. Millions of people went to sleep in one country and woke up in another, sometimes without even moving. They didn't pack bags. They didn't flee war. They just looked outside and realized the flag had changed, but the frost on the windows hadn't. Their homes were the same. Their problems were the same. And in that eerie normalcy, something deeply strange took root. A psychological vertigo that would take years to explain and decades to recover from. Because the Soviet Union hadn't just been a country, it had been a mythology, a lens through which millions viewed the world. For those born in it, the USSR was not just a state, it was a parent, a religion, a mission. It had its saints, Lenin, Gagarin, even Stalin for some. It had its commandments, unity, sacrifice, loyalty, and it had its heaven, the promised land of communism, always just one 5-year plan away. To grow up Soviet was to grow up with certainty. You didn't have to ask who you were or what you believed. It was already decided for you. Then suddenly, nothing. No more ideology, no more faith, no more map. And without that map, people were left standing in the ruins of an idea, asking the one question no one had prepared them to answer. Who am I now? This identity crisis didn't hit like a wave. It leaked in, through broken pensions, empty shelves, shuttered factories, and confused news broadcasts. In the cities, you'd see men in Soviet military uniforms selling cigarettes on street corners, former party officials working as cab drivers, university professors renting out their apartments by the hour. It was surreal. These weren't failures. These were the very people who had once built missiles, taught physics, led parades. Now they were fighting to stay warm. Because when the state fell, it didn't fall evenly. Some people fell through the cracks faster than others. The old elite, stripped of their positions, often fell hardest. But so did the elderly, the disabled, the single mothers. They had no Western dollars, no foreign relatives, no roadmap for capitalism. Just a lifetime of loyalty to a system that had vanished like smoke. The markets came quickly, but the rules didn't. Prices changed daily, sometimes hourly. Money devalued faster than people could spend it. In 1 week, your savings could buy bread. In the next, it couldn't buy air. Hyperinflation burned through the economy like a forest fire. People started trading in goods again. Soap, cigarettes, sugar. The ruble was still official, but it was trust that really disappeared. And in that vacuum, new powers rose. Oligarchs, gangsters, politicians turned businessmen turned warlords. They carved up industries like meat on a table, oil fields, banks, state-owned factories, sold, seized, stolen. It wasn't a transition. It was a feeding frenzy. And ordinary citizens, the same people who had once believed in collective farms and classless futures, now had to choose between two terrifying options: sink or swim with sharks. But here's the part people often forget. Despite the chaos, most people kept going. Not because they had a plan, but because that's what people do. They adapt, they patch, they pretend. In the neighborhoods of Moscow, Minsk and Baku, children still played in courtyards, grandmothers still knitted, men still gathered at bus stops with briefcases full of nothing, because even if there was no job, there was still pride. In villages, families went back to the land, growing potatoes, raising chickens, surviving off the grid in a country that had once promised satellites and steel. Some blamed Gorbachev, others blamed Yeltsin. Many just stopped blaming altogether. They were too tired. Survival had replaced politics. And in that weariness, a strange kind of nostalgia was born, not for the repression or the fear or the hunger, but for the certainty, for the days when the news was always the same, when the enemy was always out there, and when your life had a place inside something bigger, even if it was a lie. Meanwhile, in the former republics, new flags were rising, but old ghosts refused to leave. In Ukraine, the language of independence clashed with the weight of history. In Georgia, national pride collided with Russian tanks. In Central Asia, Soviet statues were replaced with new cults of personality. And across the Baltics, the transition westward came with both joy and trauma. Borders became real, ethnic tensions flared, families found themselves on opposite sides of nations that hadn't existed the day before. Some were granted freedom, others were handed passports that no country recognized. The dream of unity had been shattered. In its place, confusion, identity crises, and a scramble for survival that would reshape everything from foreign policy to pop music. But in all of this, the silence, the chaos, the absurdity, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union didn't just vanish in a single night. It vanished in slow motion, and its disappearance wasn't just political. It was psychological, cultural, generational. It was like erasing the only language someone had ever known and asking them to write poetry in a new one. No warning, no dictionary, just a blank page, and the pressure to perform. And somehow, millions tried. They stumbled, they bled, but they tried. Because when the sun rises over the ruins of an empire, no one gives you a script. You have to write your own. What most people forget is that the death of the Soviet Union wasn't marked by a revolution. There was no siege on the Kremlin, no gunfire echoing through Red Square, no crowds tearing down Lenin's statue while tanks roared through the streets. No, the USSR didn't collapse like a tower. It evaporated like breath on glass, slowly, invisibly, until all that was left was a smudge and the memory of warmth. And the people. They were left holding their routines like artifacts. The same alarm clocks, the same coats, the same food lines. The architecture didn't change. The air didn't shift. What changed was the meaning behind everything. Schools still opened in the morning, but now no one was sure what to teach. Do you still praise Lenin? Do you tear out pages about Stalin? Do you suddenly start calling the West your neighbor instead of your enemy? Teachers stood in front of chalkboards, rewriting curriculums mid-lesson. Some held on to old truths like lifebuoys. Others tried to pivot, to modernize, to erase, and in doing so, left students stranded between two worlds. And the children, caught in this in-between, they grew up confused. One year they were pioneers in red scarves. The next, they were told to forget it all. Imagine waking up and being told your childhood ideology is now outdated. Not wrong, not evil, just gone. A memory everyone agrees not to talk about. In the workplaces, it was no less surreal. Huge government ministries, once bustling with purpose, planning tractors, counting steel, monitoring factory output, suddenly found themselves obsolete. There was no enemy to compete with. No quotas to chase, and worst of all, no money. Employees showed up for months without pay, clinging to the hope that structure would return. Some swept empty offices, others filed reports no one would read. They weren't working for a paycheck anymore, they were working to keep normalcy alive. because if you stopped showing up, then it would be real. Then the USSR was really dead, and not everyone was ready to bury it. You see, when a nation collapses, it's not just its economy that disappears, it's a shared narrative. A story people have told themselves for decades about who they are, what their place is in the world, and what tomorrow is supposed to look like. Without that story, millions wandered through their lives like actors without scripts. They still played the role, father, worker, citizen, but the stage had vanished. And while the streets stayed mostly quiet, the silence was not peace. It was confusion, because nobody really explained what had happened. There was no televised memorial, no national moment of reflection. Just a flicker on the evening news. The Soviet Union has been dissolved. And then, the weather report. That's it. A civilization that had stretched across 11 time zones, commanded nuclear arsenals, launched men into space, terrified the West, reduced to a single sentence. No closure, no ceremony. And because of that, the trauma didn't express itself in public outcry. It fermented, quietly, privately, in living rooms, in kitchen whispers, in the way old veterans clutched their medals a little tighter, or how some grandmothers kept photos of Stalin on the wall long after it was safe to take them down. Because those symbols, the medals, the flags, the portraits, they weren't just politics. They were memory. They were anchors in a world where everything else had shifted. And for many, the new world wasn't better. Yes, there was more freedom. Yes, you could finally speak your mind, own a business, travel. But those things came with a cost. Rampant corruption, hyperinflation, lawlessness. The safety net was gone, and no one knew how to build a new one. Suddenly, it wasn't about loyalty or hard work. It was about who you knew, who you bribed, who you feared. The rules had changed, but no one had told the players. And in that vacuum, trust collapsed. People stopped believing in politicians, in institutions, in each other. Neighbors, once united by shared struggle, now eyed each other suspiciously. Ethnic tensions flared. Old wounds reopened. And in places like Chechnya, the fallout turned violent. The ghosts of empire didn't rest, they rose. In some cities, statues of Lenin were toppled. In others, they were cleaned and polished. Entire generations were split, not by age, but by worldview. Some mourned the past, others ran from it. And the youth? Many tried to live without it entirely. What made it even more complicated was that there was no villain you could point to, no singular moment to blame. The fall of the USSR wasn't one man's crime. It was a slow unraveling, economic stagnation, political rigidity, suppressed nationalism, broken promises, and a system too brittle to bend. By the time Gorbachev came along with perestroika and glasnost, it was already too late. The rot had reached the core. But even then, no one thought it would end like this. Not with war, not with revolution, but with a pen. A single signature. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was officially declared dissolved, a day after Gorbachev resigned. That's all it took. One quiet bureaucratic move to end the Cold War, to redraw the map, to send millions into identity crisis. And yet, no parades, no mourning, no answers, just quiet. And in that quiet, something peculiar happened. A generation raised to worship the collective began to rediscover the individual. Music changed, fashion changed. People wore jeans proudly, blasted Western pop songs, dyed their hair, read banned books. Freedom came, messy, raw, exhilarating. But it was not the same for everyone. In Moscow, the youth danced to Madonna and traded Game Boys. In rural Siberia, families dug potatoes from frozen ground and bartered for sugar. The divide between city and village, between those who could adapt and those who couldn't, became vast. Some soared, others sank, and the government, in its new form, struggled to contain the fallout. Russia was no longer the heart of an empire. It was just another country now, trying to stand on its own, trying to survive its own birth. But here's what still haunts many to this day: the feeling of unreality. The idea that something so massive, so total, could vanish without bloodshed or closure. That one day, your world exists, and the next, it doesn't. It's not just history, it's grief. A slow, quiet grief with no funeral. That's what makes the fall of the Soviet Union unlike any other collapse in modern memory. It didn't go out with a scream. It went out with a whisper. And millions are still listening for echoes of what it left behind. The grief didn't settle all at once. It crept in quietly like cold through the cracks of an old apartment window. You didn't wake up the day after the collapse of the Soviet Union and instantly feel like history had changed. Most people woke up and did exactly what they'd done the day before: boiled tea, lit stoves, rode the metro, counted coins, turned on their televisions, unsure if the evening broadcast would call them Soviet citizens or not. The ground hadn't split. The Kremlin was still standing, but something was off. Not visibly, not loudly, but like a missing heartbeat in a room you'd grown used to. The hammer and sickle didn't vanish with fireworks. It faded. In some places, flags were taken down slowly, almost guiltily. In others, they were never taken down at all. They frayed in silence, bleached by snow and time. Old Soviet offices still had their portraits, their seals, their phones that no longer rang. Entire agencies kept operating with no one to report to. Former KGB officers still came to work, still monitored files, still read surveillance logs, unsure who, if anyone, was in charge anymore. The files stayed, the secrets stayed, but the country that had birthed them didn't. That was the strange part. Nothing was destroyed, just unclaimed. It was as if the Soviet Union had gotten up and left in the night, leaving its clothes behind, and the people had no choice but to wear them until something new arrived. But that something new didn't come with instructions or hope. It came with price tags. Inflation devoured savings. Pensions became worthless. Those who'd spent a lifetime working for the state now found that the state had vanished, and so had their value. Retired engineers begged on subway platforms. Decorated war veterans sold cigarettes on street corners. And perhaps most haunting of all, former Communist Party officials, once feared, once revered, were now reduced to confused old men sitting in parks, watching pigeons and wondering how the world had changed, without asking for permission. There was no sense of victory, no collective sigh of relief. For many, it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like abandonment, as if the lights had gone out in a theater and no one had told the audience the play was over. People kept sitting in their seats, waiting for the curtain to rise again, but it never did. The actors had left the stage, the script had been burned, and the theater, well, no one even knew who owned it anymore. And what replaced it wasn't stability. It was chaos with a smile. Oligarchs, a word no one had used before, began appearing like mushrooms after rain. Men with no official titles but absolute power. One day they were bankers, the next day they owned oil fields. They flew in private jets, wore Western suits, and spoke a new language of markets and mergers. They didn't speak to the people. They bought them, bought factories, bought homes, bought silence. They weren't voted in. They emerged. And they didn't build the new Russia, they looted the old one. What had taken generations to construct, as steel plants, railways, research centers, was stripped down and sold off in months. A country's entire infrastructure became collateral for quick deals and offshore accounts. And the people who had built it, They watched as their life's work was auctioned like scrap. The pain wasn't just economic, it was existential. Because what do you do when the thing you spent your entire life building, the thing you were told to believe in, is declared worthless overnight? Not wrong, just gone. As if it had never mattered, as if you had never mattered. Some tried to forget, some drank. Vodka became both a coping mechanism and a silent protest. Bars were full, hospitals were full, cemeteries too. The life expectancy of Russian men dropped dramatically in the years following the collapse. It wasn't just from poverty, it was from disillusionment, a kind of national heartbreak that medicine couldn't fix. Because the truth is, the Soviet Union didn't just die. It took something with it, a sense of belonging, of direction, of shared struggle. Yes, that struggle had often been brutal, but it had been collective. You knew your role. You knew your enemy. You knew what tomorrow was supposed to be. After 1991, all of that evaporated, and in its place came 1,000 versions of the future, none of them guaranteed, none of them familiar. The West celebrated, of course. They spoke of freedom, democracy, open markets. But the average citizen in Minsk or Omsk or Ulan-Ude didn't feel free. They felt exposed. They weren't walking into the light. They were wandering into fog. And the West, the supposed model for this new life, didn't offer much help. Aid was limited. Advice was contradictory. One minute it was shock therapy, the next it was gradual reform. All of it felt like an experiment. And the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks were the lab rats. Some countries fared better than others. Some sank into conflict. Some vanished into dictatorships with new flags. But everywhere, the feeling was the same. You are on your own now. The system is gone. The safety is gone. The meaning, you'll have to find that yourself. And for those who couldn't, who still saw the red star in their dreams, who still remembered the parades, the anthems, the slogans, the collapse wasn't just political, it was personal. They weren't just mourning a nation, they were mourning their youth, their certainty, their place in the world. Because say what you will about the Soviet Union, it made its citizens feel like part of something enormous, something eternal. And now that eternity had ended, not with a bang, but with a shrug. So when people say the Soviet Union collapsed, it's not entirely accurate. It dissolved, quietly, without ceremony. And in its place came silence, a silence that still hasn't been fully broken. Because how do you grieve a country that told you grief was weakness? How do you mourn a system that taught you mourning was for the decadent West? You don't. You endure, you adapt, you survive. But deep down, you remember. You remember the silence that came after the anthem stopped playing, and the cold, eerie question that echoed afterward. Now what? What happens to a country that forgets its own shape overnight? That's what the people of the former Soviet Union faced in the strange days after the collapse. A map full of names they had never used, borders they had never respected, and identities they had never claimed. Suddenly, people who had spent their entire lives as Soviets were now asked to become something else. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Armenians, Georgians. The list went on. Some clung to these new names with pride. Others looked at their passports with confusion. What does it even mean to change your nationality without ever moving your feet? It wasn't just about geography. It was about memory. Streets changed names. Statues came down. Currency was redesigned. School books were rewritten. Holidays were replaced. But people's memories didn't change. A woman who had lived in Leningrad for 50 years still called it Leningrad, even if the sign now said St. Petersburg. Petersburg. A man who fought under the Red Banner didn't suddenly become a patriot of a new republic just because his uniform was outdated. He still wore his medals, still stood straight on Victory Day. But there was a quiet sadness behind his salute because he wasn't sure what he was saluting anymore. And that confusion wasn't limited to the elderly. Children too were caught between worlds. One day they were singing Soviet songs in school. The next they were learning new anthems in a language their parents didn't even speak fluently. History lessons were no longer about glorifying the October Revolution. Now they were about surviving the economic disaster of the 90s. Whole generations were being reprogrammed while still holding on to half-finished beliefs. It was like being asked to switch religions halfway through prayer, not because you wanted to, but because your God had quietly left the building. And then there was the question no one dared to ask out loud. Had it all been a lie? Had everything, the ideology, the pride, the struggle, the sacrifice, been for nothing? That was the deepest wound. Because if the Soviet Union could disappear so easily, what did that say about the millions who had died for it? About the victories of Stalingrad? About the cosmonauts? About the farmers and miners and teachers who gave their lives to the state without asking for anything in return? Were they fools? Were they heroes? Or were they just casualties of a dream that was never real? There were no easy answers, and so most people stopped asking. They focused instead on survival, food, heat, medicine. In some regions, people resorted to bartering, trading shoes for flour or vodka for antibiotics. The ruble collapsed, prices doubled, then tripled, then became meaningless. You could hold an entire month's salary in your hand and not be able to buy bread. Hyperinflation didn't just eat away at savings, it devoured trust. Trust in institutions, trust in neighbors, trust in the future. Crime surged. Corruption became the rule, not the exception. Police officers took bribes not because they were evil, but because their wages had stopped coming. Doctors charged under the table. Teachers sold smuggled goods on the side. It wasn't greed. It was survival. And the result was a kind of moral erosion that no one wanted to talk about. Because how do you admit that a country's soul is rotting when its body has already been pronounced dead? Meanwhile, the political vacuum filled with something more dangerous than chaos: nostalgia. Not for communism necessarily, but for order, for clarity, for the sense, however illusionary, that someone was in charge, that someone knew where the country was going. And in that craving for direction, the seeds of authoritarianism were quietly planted. People didn't want freedom anymore. They wanted certainty. They wanted strong leaders, not fragile parliaments. They wanted law and order, not democracy and debate. They didn't want to be lied to, but they didn't want the truth either, not if the truth meant more pain. And that's when the shadows returned. Old institutions rebranded. Old habits re-emerged. Surveillance quietly resumed. Journalists disappeared. Opposition leaders fell silent. The language of the past crept back in, not with hammers and sickles, but with flags and slogans and security bills. And once again, fear became normal. Not the fear of gulags or midnight knocks, but the quieter fear of saying the wrong thing in the wrong place to the wrong person. It was softer now, smarter, but no less real. The Soviet Union had died, but parts of its spirit, the parts that knew how to dominate, to divide, to silence, never really left. And yet even in this fractured post-collapse world, people found ways to go on. They planted gardens, they raised children, they fell in love. They formed rock bands and started cafes and painted murals over the crumbling Lenin statues. Life didn't stop, it just got smaller, less idealistic, more private. People built new rituals out of old routines. They joked about the past because laughing was easier than crying. They drank to forget. Yes, but also to remember, because even broken memories were better than no memories at all. And in small ways, hope returned. Not through grand speeches or revolutions, but through stubborn acts of living. A teacher who stayed in her classroom even when her salary disappeared. A father who fixed shoes because no one could afford new ones. A grandmother who kept baking bread from scratch just so her family would feel like something still made sense. These were not political acts, they were survival acts. But they were also acts of quiet rebellion. Because in a country where everything had been taken, identity, purpose, pride, to keep going was the most defiant thing of all. So how did the Soviet Union vanish in a single night? Not with a bang, not with a war, but with a sigh, a paper signed, a flag lowered, a new anthem played on tired instruments, and behind it all, millions of people blinking in the dim light, wondering what had just happened and what came next. The answer, even now, remains unclear. But one thing is certain: the collapse wasn't just the end of a country. It was the beginning of 1,000 different stories. Stories of loss, confusion, reinvention, and resilience. Stories still being written today in every apartment block, every old train station, every faded mural of Lenin still clinging to a crumbling wall. The Soviet Union vanished, but its ghost never left. And if you listen closely, in the silence between headlines, in the pauses between generations, you can still hear it breathing. The strangest part of the Soviet Union's death wasn't just how quietly it happened. It was how many people didn't believe it had really happened at all. For weeks, even months after that December night in 1991, ordinary citizens across the former republics kept waiting for someone to reverse it. A speech, a coup, a military declaration. Anything. The old habits were too deeply rooted. The red flags still fluttered from balconies. The portraits of Lenin still hung in schoolrooms. Soviet uniforms were still worn by security guards and traffic police. Radio stations still played patriotic marches. Entire cities still operated on Soviet time, in Soviet architecture, with Soviet logic. You could walk through Moscow, Kyiv, or Almaty in January 1992 and see a world that looked exactly like December 1991. Same buses, same shops, same slogans painted on brick walls. Only now, the center of that world was missing. The empire had vanished, but the routines remained, like a body that hadn't noticed the brain had stopped firing. In some towns, especially rural villages, people didn't even know the USSR had dissolved. The news hadn't reached them yet. Or if it had, they didn't believe it. That's impossible, one farmer told a visiting